Snow was falling when the officers gathered near the edge of Frost Creek, the kind of slow winter drift that softens every sound until the world feels wrapped in cotton. It was supposed to be a routine recovery of old evidence, a final sweep before the police archive remodeled its basement wing. No one expected anything significant. Nothing from a case this old ever moves. But the woman standing nearest the creek, Detective Lila Harrow, held a thin, translucent evidence sleeve in her gloved hand, as if it weighed more than anything she'd ever carried. The sleeve contained only a small, cracked slide box. Its label, faded to the color of cigarette ash, barely showed the imprint of letters written sometime in the late 50s. There was no dramatic moment of revelation, no sudden gasp. Only a quiet tightening of her expression as she angled the plastic toward the pale winter light. Through the distorted glass inside the box, she saw what almost no one had noticed in 63 years, a fragment preserved by accident, a single remnant of a life long erased. It was impossibly small, almost weightless, and yet everything about it suggested an unfinished story waiting to surface. Around her, the trees creaked softly in the cold. Frost Creek moved in sluggish ribbons beneath a thin sheet of ice, the same creek that decades earlier had mirrored the outline of a cardboard box resting near a fallen birch tree. Older officers remembered the story. Younger ones had only heard fragments, the way towns pass down myths when the truth is too painful to hold intact. The boy without a name, the box meant for new beginnings, the blanket worn thin by time. They didn't know details, but they recognized the quiet reverence in Harrow's posture. She lowered the sleeve and exhaled slowly. The cold air turned her breath into a pale cloud that drifted away, disappearing before it reached the tree line. The small crowd stepped back, giving her space, unsure of what she had found, but instinctively aware that something had shifted. The archive workers who had accompanied her tasked with sorting, cleaning, and destroying old evidence that no longer held legal value stood motionless. One of them muttered that the slide must have been misfiled for decades. Another wondered aloud if it even belonged to the case they were reviewing. But Harrow didn't speak. Her silence was steadier than doubt. She knew the history of the object she carried, even if she didn't yet know the name of the child it once belonged to. She had reopened the old Ridgehaven file months earlier, driven by a sense that the case's loose ends were not loose by nature, but by neglect. She had reviewed every outdated report, every faint photograph, every artifact that had been touched too many times by hands that no longer belonged to the living. Something in the way the old evidence collectors had documented the scene had always unsettled her, as if they sensed more, but never found it. She walked up the slope away from the creek, the frozen ground crunching under her boots. The town lay spread out beyond the hill, its streets lined with long-closed workshops and narrow brick homes. Ridgehaven had changed over the years, but some stories never left. People still whispered about the child in the box. They still avoided certain topics at family gatherings, still exchanged uneasy glances when the old case appeared in anniversary news segments. This place carried memory the way old wood carried the smell of smoke long after the fire was gone. Harrow paused near the patrol car and looked again at the tiny slide box. Through the distortion of the glass, she saw the glint of something pale and preserved. It was a fragile reminder of the child whose face had been drawn and redrawn by forensic artists, until the sketches were pinned onto church walls, gas station corkboards, and the bulletin board of the local diner. People had speculated endlessly about who he was. Some believed he came from a traveling family. Others swore they remembered seeing a small boy with downcast eyes walking beside an older man through the alleys near River Street. None of it ever solidified into evidence. As she held the artifact closer, the wind shifted. The snowflakes thickened, drifting sideways across the field. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from distant chimneys, a scent that cast a strange warmth over the cold landscape. Harrow thought of all the unnamed victims across the country, all the children who had been buried under paperwork and silence. She had entered this job knowing that justice was not always about verdicts. Sometimes it was about restoring the simplest truth: identity. She turned to the officers waiting near the vehicles. Her voice was steady when she told them she was taking the slide directly to the state lab. They nodded, but their eyes carried questions they did not ask. One officer leaned against the hood of the patrol car, watching her with the subdued caution reserved for moments that feel larger than the present. Perhaps he sensed what she did, that the past, no matter how deeply buried, sometimes stirs when the right hands touch the right forgotten object. As Harrow climbed into her vehicle, she took one last look at the frozen creek. The memory of the cardboard box described countless times in archived reports seemed to echo through the silence. She imagined the moment it had been found decades earlier. The shock, the confusion, the unbearable stillness around a life that had ended far too soon. That single image had defined the case for generations. Now, for the first time, the story felt poised to move again. She closed the door, started the engine, and held the slide carefully in her lap. The snow on the windshield melted into thin rivulets, clearing her view of the empty road stretching toward the lab. To understand how this began, we go back to 1958. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. In the winter mornings of Ridgehaven, when the sun arrived slowly and the chimney sent thin streams of smoke into the pale sky, a small boy often wandered to the front porch of a narrow brick house on Latchford Lane. His name was Eli Rowan Weathers, though few outside his immediate family ever used all three names. Most simply called him Eli. He was 5 years old, slight for his age, with the quiet manner of a child who had learned to observe before speaking. Neighbors remembered seeing him now and then, standing near the railing with his hands curled close to his chest, watching the older children walk to school with lunch pails swinging beside them. Eli did not attend school yet, though he was old enough. His family situation was complicated, shaped by shifting guardianship and the kind of strained relationships that often go unspoken in small towns. Some days he stayed with his mother's cousin, other days with his uncle by marriage, and occasionally with an older couple down the street who took him in when things became tense at home. None of it was recorded in official paperwork. It simply happened the way some things do in communities where people try to help but don't know how to fix the root of what's wrong. Inside the house, the air often smelled faintly of coal and boiled potatoes. The wallpaper had begun to peel in narrow strips, revealing thin cracks in the plaster beneath. This was the world Eli knew: narrow rooms, creaking floors, and voices that grew too loud too quickly. The adults in his life drifted between fatigue and frustration, not cruel in every moment, but unpredictable enough that he learned to make himself small, quiet, nearly invisible. He wasn't a child who cried easily. Instead, he carried an inwardness that seemed too old for him. Still, there were moments of gentleness. The older couple down the street, the Mallorys, sometimes invited him in when they saw him lingering near their gate. Mrs. Mallory made tea with extra honey, stirring it until the steam smelled sweet and warm. She kept a basket of mismatched wooden toys that once belonged to her grown sons. Eli's favorite was a small horse with one broken wheel. He would run his thumb along the smooth edges of the wood as if memorizing its shape. She often told him he could take it home, but he always shook his head and placed it back in the basket before leaving, as though he believed the toy wouldn't feel safe anywhere else. Eli wasn't a child who spoke much, but he listened. He listened to the creak of the porch step, the hiss of the radiator pipes, the distant whistle of trains passing through Ridgehaven in the late afternoons. He listened to the rustle of the wind through the trees behind the house, a sound that seemed to shift in tone depending on the season. Sometimes, when the air was still enough, he would look upward as if waiting for something to be said that only he could hear. His most treasured possession was a faded wool blanket, blue with a thin white stripe near its border. It was older than he was, frayed at the edges, but it carried a softness that comforted him in ways words never had. He often wrapped it around his shoulders on cold mornings, letting the corner trail behind him as he walked through the house. When he was sent to stay with relatives, The blanket went with him, folded neatly under his arm. Adults sometimes commented on it with impatience, but he held it tightly all the same. It was less a blanket than a tether, one constant in a life full of shifting rooms and shifting rules. On certain days, when the tension in the house rose too sharply, Eli slipped outside to the backyard. The ground there was uneven, scattered with brittle weeds and the remains of an unused shed. But near the back fence, where the sunlight reached longest in the afternoons, a patch of grass stayed green even in early winter. Eli would sit there, holding a smooth stone he had found near the creek during the summer. The stone was oval, pale gray, cool to the touch even on warm days. He kept it as a quiet treasure, something he could control when everything else felt uncertain. The neighbors who saw him described a boy who seemed both present and distant, as though his mind drifted somewhere just beyond reach. They remembered the calmness of his expression, the way he held his blanket close, the way he seemed to listen for something no one else could hear. He wasn't unhappy in every moment, but he lived on the edge of a world where joy was fragile. Sometimes when the Mallorys had him over for dinner, he would lean toward their radio, listening to the soft hum of old songs. Mrs. Mallory once tried to teach him how to hum along. He tried, quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though afraid someone might hear him and decide he was doing it wrong. She asked if he liked music, and he nodded once. She asked what kind. He whispered, barely audible, that he liked the ones that sounded like rain. As winter deepened and the days shortened, Eli's appearances outside became less frequent. People noticed but said little. In towns like Ridgehaven, silence often grows from the belief that someone else will ask the questions that need asking. The Mallorys wondered why he hadn't come by in several days. Mrs. Mallory thought about walking to the house and knocking on the door, but each time she considered it, something, timidity, politeness, uncertainty, held her back. The last day they saw him was strangely ordinary. It was late afternoon, and a thin layer of frost clung to the windows of their house. Eli appeared at the gate, his blanket wrapped around him. He didn't come inside. He simply stood there, shifting his weight, looking as though he had a question he couldn't phrase. Mrs. Mallory opened the door and greeted him. He lifted one hand slightly, almost in a half wave, then looked toward the street as if someone had called his name from far away. She asked him if he wanted to come in for a warm drink. He hesitated. For a moment, his expression flickered with something like hope, but then he lowered his gaze and shook his head. He told her he had to go home, though the way he said it made her wonder if he was repeating someone else's instruction. She watched him walk down the empty road, his small figure growing smaller with each step, the blue blanket trailing behind him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. When he reached the corner, he paused, looked back once, and then turned the corner out of sight. She didn't know that this would be the last time anyone outside his household saw him. She didn't know that the boy walking down the road, wrapped in a frayed blue blanket, was drifting into a silence that would last more than 6 decades. She only remembered the slight wave of his hand, the unspoken question in his eyes, and the way the cold air seemed to follow him as though it understood something she did not. The winter of 1958 tightened its grip on Ridgehaven slowly, filling the days with a heavy stillness. In the week leading to the boy's disappearance, the temperature had fallen below freezing each night, hardening the ground and glazing the rooftops with thin layers of frost that glittered like fractured glass at sunrise. The cold made every sound sharper. Doors shutting echoed down narrow streets. Train whistles traveled farther across the hills. Even conversations carried a certain brittleness, as if the weather had seeped into the bones of the town itself. The timeline began quietly enough. Ayla had been seen 3 days before the discovery, walking home from the Mallory's gate, wrapped in his blue wool blanket. The older couple, preoccupied with their evening chores, assumed he had simply returned to whichever relative was responsible for him that week. In Ridgehaven, children often drifted between households when families struggled. It was a pattern people observed, but rarely questioned. The silence that followed his disappearance was gradual. No one noticed immediately that he was gone. A day later, the cold intensified. The roads froze in thin sheets. Smoke from the mills hung low over the town, trapped by the heavy air. On Latchford Lane, the house where Eli had been staying remained dim throughout the morning. No voices came through the windows. No movement stirred behind the curtains. Neighbors walking to work glanced at the place out of habit, but nothing seemed unusual enough to pause their routines. By the second night, frost had thickened on the porch steps. A single porch light flickered, blinking irregularly before going out entirely. Somewhere inside, a door shut with enough force for one neighbor to take note, but the noise was swallowed quickly by the wind sweeping in from the hills. On the third day, just before dawn, the wind carried a sharp stillness that made the town feel suspended. Fog hovered low across Frost Creek as a hunter named Loren Maddox made his way along the ridgeline, searching for signs of deer. Maddox was in his 40s, accustomed to walking the frozen paths alone. He knew the land intimately, knew how the trees bent in heavy snow and how the creek sounded when it ran beneath thin ice. As he approached the bend near the old birch tree, something caught his eye, a rectangular shape resting where it shouldn't be. It sat half hidden near the base of the tree, a cardboard container with softened water-stained edges. The side of the box bore faint lettering, barely visible from where he stood. At first, Maddox assumed it had been discarded by someone careless. Debris washed down the creek every season. He took a step closer and noticed that the lid was partially open, revealing the corner of a wool blanket. He paused. The color of the fabric, blue with a thin white stripe, seemed out of place against the stark winter landscape. A blanket in a cardboard box was unusual enough, but something about the way it was folded made him uneasy. It looked deliberate. Not thrown away, but placed. Maddox approached slowly, aware that frost made the ground unpredictable. When he reached the box, he kneeled beside it and touched the side. The cardboard gave slightly under his fingers, softened by moisture, but intact. The air around the box felt colder somehow, as though the temperature dipped in that small pocket of space. He lifted the lid. The sight inside drove the breath from his chest. He didn't shout. He didn't speak. He simply stared at the still form of a child, curled slightly as if asleep, wrapped in the familiar blue blanket. The boy's face was pale, softened by the diffuse morning light filtering through the trees. His hair clung to his forehead in fine strands. He looked impossibly small. Maddox rose unsteadily and stepped back, the ground crunching under him. He had lived in Ridgehaven all his life, had witnessed hardship and harsh winters, but nothing prepared him for this. He forced himself to look away long enough to gather his thoughts, then hurried toward town, moving faster than he had in years. The cold air stung his lungs, urging him forward. When authorities arrived, the sun had climbed just enough to cast long beams across the clearing. Officers moved carefully, their breath drifting upward in pale clouds. They documented the scene with the limited tools they had, taking notes on the box's position, the surrounding footprints, the frost patterns. The birch tree's bark was marked by faint scrapes, as though someone had brushed against it while lowering the box to the ground. The creek, partially frozen, murmured beneath a sheet of ice, carrying flecks of dirt that caught the light. The child was removed gently, lifted with the blanket still wrapped around him. One officer brushed a strand of hair from the boy's forehead, glancing briefly at his colleagues as they exchanged silent looks of disbelief. Small bruises were visible across the limbs, old enough to have faded but distinct in pattern. The skin showed signs of prolonged neglect, though the freezing temperatures had preserved some details. Despite the cold, the air felt heavy with the weight of what they were witnessing. The box itself was examined. It was identified as a linen delivery container once used by a company that serviced several towns across northern Maryland. The lettering, though faded, matched a style common in the mid-50s. Traces of soil clung to the bottom flaps, different from the creek sediment. The interior contained faint fabric fibers that did not belong to the blanket. Some fibers were beige, some greenish. Investigators noted them, but could not determine their origin. Around the clearing, footprints were faint but present. One set belonged to Maddox, clearly marked by the tread of his boots. The spacing suggested someone had walked carefully, as if trying not to leave a trail. These prints led toward a narrow path that cut through the trees, a path locals rarely used in winter. The ground was too hard to capture clear impressions, but the faint depressions remained intriguing. As the officers surveyed the area, they found the smooth stone Eli had carried during warmer months. It rested a few feet from the box, half buried in frost. Its presence puzzled investigators. The stone showed no sign of being dropped recently, yet it seemed positioned intentionally, as though placed rather than falling naturally. The detail was recorded, then set aside when more urgent concerns filled their focus. The discovery sent ripples through Ridgehaven. People gathered outside their homes, whispering about the boy found near the creek. Some speculated he was a stranger. Others feared he belonged to someone in the neighborhood. The Mallorys, upon hearing the news, felt a heaviness settle over them. Mrs. Mallory lingered on the thought of Eli's last visit, replaying his hesitant wave and the way he had clutched his blanket. Investigators followed the initial leads methodically. They visited every household on Latchford Lane, asking about missing children. Most answers were vague. Some seemed overly rehearsed. The house where Eli had last stayed presented the officers with a peculiar silence. The man who answered the door claimed everything was fine, that no children were missing, that the house had been calm in recent days. But the officers noticed the uneasy flicker in his expression and the way he hesitated before each denial. Inside, the rooms felt colder than the winter air outside. The floors creaked and a faint smell of dampness lingered. The officers spotted a narrow door near the back of the house, leading down to a basement. When they asked to see it, the man hesitated before producing a key. The lock turned stiffly, as if it had not been used in months. The basement revealed little at first glance. Dust coated the shelves. Old tools lay rusted against the walls. But near the far corner, behind an old water heater, they noticed a section of floor where dust had been disturbed recently. The faint outlines of small footprints, half faded, were visible. The size matched that of a young child. The officers exchanged glances but found nothing else immediately incriminating. Back at the creek, a deputy flagged a curious detail. On the underside of the cardboard box, faint diagonal scratches ran in parallel lines. They were shallow, almost invisible, and did not appear to be caused by the box's transport. One investigator suggested they might have come from the roots of the tree. Another argued they didn't match the pattern. The scratches remained an unresolved clue, noted in the report, but without clear explanation. As the body was transported to the county coroner, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the clearing wrapped in muted gray. The birch tree's white bark glowed faintly in the twilight, and the creek's frozen surface darkened into a sheet of dull metal. The officers packed their equipment and left, their thoughts lingering on the small figure they had carried away. The town settled into an uneasy silence that night. Fires burned behind closed doors. Conversations grew cautious. People leaned closer to their radios, waiting for updates. The Mallorys sat together in their living room, Mrs. Mallory clutching a handkerchief as she whispered her fears to her husband. In the days that followed, the investigation widened. The boy's description was circulated across counties, but no matching missing persons were reported. The lack of identification deepened the mystery and increased the pressure on investigators. The unanswered questions mounted. Who placed the box there? Why choose Frost Creek? Why wrap him in the blanket he always carried? And what did the faint scratches beneath the box mean? The crime scene, though documented thoroughly, offered only partial truths. It gave shape to what had happened, but not why. It revealed a moment of care mixed with abandonment. A child laid gently but deliberately in a place where discovery was possible but not guaranteed. It hinted at secrecy layered over fear. And somewhere among the quiet details, a misplaced stone, faint footprints, unexplained scratches rested the clues that would one day push the case forward again. In the days following the discovery of Frost Creek, the Ridgehaven Police Department poured its limited resources into the investigation. Officers visited every household within a 2-mile radius, questioning residents about children, visitors, or unusual activity. People opened their doors reluctantly, offering fragments of recollections that rarely aligned. Some insisted they had seen nothing. Others claimed they heard arguments echoing from the house where Eli had been staying, though none could specify the time or the voices. The tension in the air felt like a weight pressing down on the town. The first serious lead came from a man who worked at the linen service company, whose logo faintly matched the lettering on the cardboard box. He arrived at the station with a stack of delivery logs, flipping through them quickly at the front desk. He pointed to a set of receipts from months earlier, connecting deliveries to homes scattered across Ridgehaven and neighboring areas. But when officers tried to trace which exact box could have matched the one found near the creek, they learned the company reused, redistributed, and discarded boxes without maintaining any consistent serialization. Their boxes passed through dozens of hands each week. The lead collapsed before it started. A week later, the police questioned a traveling repairman who frequently worked on homes near Frost Creek. Someone had reported seeing him carrying a large box from his truck earlier that month. Under pressure, the man admitted he occasionally collected scrap cardboard to start fires in the wood stoves of rural cabins. That, combined with his passing resemblance to a composite sketch made from vague community descriptions, led investigators to treat him as a person of interest. For 3 days, his name circulated in rumor kitchens across Ridgehaven. Only when his work logs and travel records proved airtight did the accusations fall apart. He left town permanently, later writing a letter to the local paper accusing the police of destroying his reputation. As winter receded and the frost melted along the creek bed, new concerns emerged. One of the officers discovered that heavy snowfall earlier in the month had likely erased footprints and traces that could have led investigators closer to the truth. The realization spread like a quiet grief across the department. The timeline had been too narrow, the evidence too easily disrupted. The child's remains had been preserved by the cold, but the clues surrounding him had not been spared. The media attention increased pressure. Reporters from Baltimore and Harrisburg arrived, setting up outside the station and pressing detectives for answers. Interviews ran on evening broadcasts, and headlines asked why no one in Ridgehaven could identify the boy. A journalist once directed a microphone at a weary officer, asking, "How does a child vanish in a town this small without anyone noticing?" The officer, exhausted from days without rest, replied that some disappearances begin long before anyone realizes they've happened. Families across the region called in with tips. Some were heartbreaking, from parents who had lost children to illness or domestic turmoil years earlier. They asked if the boy could be theirs, hoping for closure. Most inquiries were dismissed quickly, but each conversation took a toll. Investigators carried unseen sorrow for the families who lived without answers, even when their tragedies did not intersect with this one. The first circumstantial suspect emerged when officers spoke again with the household where Eli had last been seen. The man who answered the door was defensive, insisting no child had been with them recently. But a neighbor insisted she had heard a child crying late at night earlier that month. Officers pressed the man, who grew agitated and threatened to contact a lawyer. Without physical evidence tying him to the crime, the department stepped back. The case stalled once more, weighed down by accusations that could not be substantiated. Midway through spring, a woman from 3 towns over reported that a young boy matching the victim's description had boarded a bus alone. She remembered the blanket, the blue and white pattern, though her memory faltered when she tried to recall other details. Officers traveled to the bus depot, combed through old tickets, interviewed drivers. None remembered such a child. The lead dissipated, leaving investigators frustrated by how often memory distorted itself into false certainty. Another tip came from a retired midwife who thought she recognized the child's facial reconstruction from the community bulletin boards. She believed he resembled a child born to a family living near the Pennsylvania border. Officers followed her hunch and traveled there, only to learn that the child she referenced had moved out of state with his relatives years earlier. His school records confirmed he was alive and well. The midwife apologized, embarrassed by her mistake. As months turned into a year, a palpable fatigue settled over the department. Detectives rotated on and off the case, each hoping a new set of eyes would unlock a breakthrough. But the evidence remained thin, worn by time. The cardboard box degraded further each passing season. Fibers and soil samples offered little beyond what was already known. The blanket, though distinctive, was a common weave sold regionally. There was no manufacturer traceable through catalogs. Investigators turned to social service records from the past 5 years, looking for signs of unresolved neglect involving young children. The files were incomplete, disorganized, and vague. Several cases described temporary foster placements or informal guardianships, usually involving family members stepping in during periods of economic hardship. The descriptions were so general that they could apply to half a dozen children within a 20-mile radius. None matched Eli definitively. What unsettled detectives most was the absence of any official missing person report. In a town where nearly every family knew one another, such silence felt like a confession. How could a child vanish without anyone stepping forward? Officers drove through neighborhoods, talking to store owners, church members, and factory workers. Some spoke of families stretched thin, parents overwhelmed, relatives taking in children informally. But no one could name the boy in the sketch or admit to knowing him. Over the years, new detectives inherited the case. One, fresh from training, brought fresh optimism. He pursued the faint footprints found in the basement of the house where Eli had last been seen. He visited the property repeatedly, convinced there was something hidden beneath the dust and rust. But inspections revealed nothing that could firmly link the space to the crime. The footprint outlines faded with time, sinking deeper into ambiguity. Another detective pored over the diagonal scratches found beneath the cardboard box. He compared them to roots, rocks, and even animal claws, searching for patterns. But none matched cleanly enough to confirm. The scratches remained a puzzle piece without a picture, recorded, and then set aside as the trail went cold once more. By the late 60s, the case file had grown thick with false leads, notes, and photographs marked by fingerprints of long-retired officers. It moved from desk to desk, occupying the space between obligation and resignation. New cases demanded attention: robberies, disputes, missing person reports with immediate urgency. The boy in the box, still nameless, became a presence felt only in moments of quiet reflection within the department. Occasionally, the Mallorys visited the station to ask if anything new had been discovered. Their steps grew slower over the years, their questions softer. They remembered the child who had once stood at their gate, clutching his blanket, unsure of where he belonged. Their sorrow was a reminder that the case was not just a file. It had roots in human connection, however brief. Officers felt a heaviness in their conversations with the couple, knowing they had no updates to offer. Community interest ebbed and flowed. New residents barely knew the story. Older residents carried it like an unresolved memory they had grown too tired to revisit. Children who once heard whispered warnings about Frost Creek grew up and moved away, leaving behind only an echo of fear. The birch tree near the creek continued to stand, its bark thinning, as seasons circled without bringing any clarity. In the 70s, a reporter revisited the case, publishing a feature titled "The Boy Ridgehaven Forgot." It reignited conversation for a brief period. People debated theories in diners and church halls, revisiting old suspicions. But without new evidence, the story faded again. The reporter moved on to other assignments. The police, pressured by budget constraints and shifting priorities, reduced their cold case activity. By the 90s, only one detective, nearing retirement, kept the file accessible. He described the case as a ghost that lingered in the corners of the department, unchanged yet impossible to ignore. He reviewed the photographs occasionally, as if waiting for something to shift, for a detail he had missed decades earlier. But the images remained the same: a cardboard box, a blue blanket, a pale winter sky over Frost Creek. Eventually, the file was placed in long-term storage, wrapped in a string and marked with the date of archival transfer. Dust gathered on its surface. The papers inside yellowed. The town moved forward, even if some memories resisted fading. When the basement of the police station was remodeled in the early 2000s, the file was relocated again, this time to a deeper shelf, behind rows of cases that had also outgrown their initial timelines. The officers doing the transfer noted nothing unusual. To them, the case was simply another piece of the past. The final notation entered into the log read, "Status unchanged. No viable leads. File closed pending new evidence." The line lingered in the air long after the pen lifted from the page, a quiet acknowledgement that the truth was still somewhere out there, suspended between silence and the hope that time at last might shift in its favor. The years after the discovery at Frost Creek unfolded with a slow, steady quietness, the kind that settles over a community when a tragedy remains unanswered for too long. Ridgehaven changed in small ways at first. The mills downsized. A grocery store closed. Families moved away, hoping for better luck in cities where their names were unknown. For those who stayed, the memory of the child in the box lingered like a faint imprint, softened by time but never fully erased. In the early 60s, the Mallorys kept a single photograph pinned to their kitchen wall, an artist's rendering of the boy based on the face the coroner reconstructed. The drawing was gentle, showing a child with wide eyes and a shy tilt of the head. It wasn't perfect, but it captured something fragile and hopeful. Mrs. Mallory began writing small notes on scraps of paper and placing them beside the picture. Some were simple, like a reminder that she had once warmed tea for him. Others were longer, recounting moments she had never shared with anyone. "You hummed when the radio played," one note read. "Only a little, but I heard it." As the couple aged, their steps slowed, their hair grayed, and their friends dwindled. Yet the photograph remained exactly where it had always been. Sometimes they would glance at it during quiet mornings, wondering who he had been, where he had come from, and why his life had ended alone. On stormy nights when the wind pressed against the windows with a low moan, Mrs. Mallory found herself whispering a promise she never fully formed. Something about not forgetting about keeping a light on for a child who never got to grow up. By the 70s, new families lived on Latchford Lane. Children played ball in the street without knowing the significance of the house at the end of the block or the creek beyond the ridge. The story passed between generations through fragments, sometimes in hushed warnings whispered to wandering children, sometimes in mentions during church gatherings when someone brought up the hardships of earlier decades. But the name Haven Boy, coined by a journalist during a brief resurgence of interest, endured longer than any official label. It sounded almost affectionate, though the reality behind it was anything but. In scrapbooks stored in attics, old newspaper clippings documented the case in yellowed columns. The headlines shifted over time, from urgent questions to resigned summaries, from pleas for information to anniversary reflections that grew shorter and more detached with each passing decade. Somewhere in the middle of one such scrapbook, a handwritten note in fading ink read, "If someone knows, let them come forward." But no one ever did. Across town, the station where the case file was kept underwent renovations. Officers sorted through cabinets filled with aging documents. A young recruit once paused at the worn folder, flipping through its brittle pages before being called away. The moment passed without consequence, but something about the case stayed with him. Years later, he would remember that feeling when reading about advances in forensic science. though at the time it was nothing more than an instinct he couldn't articulate. Families who might have known pieces of the truth drifted apart. Some moved out of state, carrying unspoken histories with them. Others stayed quiet even as age softened their memories and blurred the edges of their regrets. The Weathers family, fractured long before Eli's disappearance, splintered further. Relatives lost touch. Letters went unanswered. Births and deaths accumulated in records that no longer connected cleanly to one another. Somewhere in the corners of those genealogical branches, Eli's missing name cast a hollow space no one acknowledged directly. In the 80s, Ridgehaven began to modernize slowly. A new highway cut through the hills, bringing with it small bursts of commerce and unfamiliar faces. Children who grew up in those years heard the story of the Haven boy only when older relatives brought it up during quiet evenings. The details shifted with each retelling. Some insisted he had been found by a fisherman. Others claimed the family responsible had fled the state. Truth and myth intertwined until the line between them blurred beyond recognition. A retired journalist, sorting through boxes of old drafts in his home office, found an unpublished column he had written decades earlier about the case. In it, he described the town's ache, the sense of collective guilt that comes when a child slips through the cracks of community care. He read the piece twice, contemplating whether to revisit the story. But life had grown small and quiet for him. His energy faded with the years, and the article never found its way to print. Then came the 90s, bringing with them the rise of digital archiving and early online forums where people discussed unresolved mysteries. A blurry photograph of the boy's facial reconstruction resurfaced, scanned by someone who had clipped it from an old newspaper. Strangers speculated about the case, their theories scattered across early message boards. Ridgehaven residents discovered the revived interest only sporadically, often by accident. Some felt a renewed tug of sorrow. Others considered it little more than passing curiosity from distant onlookers. During these same years, the Mallory's health declined. Mr. Mallory passed first, leaving behind a house filled with gentle stillness. The wooden toy basket, untouched for decades, remained beneath the table in their living room. The small wooden horse with the broken wheel still sat inside, its edges smoothed by a child's thumb long ago. When Mrs. Mallory sorted through her belongings, she paused at the photograph of Eli on the kitchen wall. She held it for a long moment, brushing dust from its corners. Later that winter, when she passed away peacefully in her sleep, her niece found the photograph tucked into her dresser drawer, wrapped in tissue paper as though it was something fragile that needed protection from time. The 2000s brought technological leaps that changed how cold cases were approached. DNA databases expanded. Scientific tools grew more sensitive. Techniques once impossible became commonplace. Detectives in small departments attended conferences where presenters spoke about solving decades-old crimes with new methods. Some listened with cautious hope, others with skepticism. Ridgehaven's officers understood the potential, but faced budget constraints and heavy caseloads. The Haven Boy file, packed away in long-term storage, remained untouched. Yet the idea that science could one day provide answers began to spread quietly through law enforcement circles. A new generation of detectives entered the force with fresh determination. They approached the archives differently, knowing that even a fragment could become meaningful if technology caught up. They spoke about micro-extraction, about mitochondrial tracing, about the possibility of solving cold cases once deemed unsolvable. Those conversations brought a faint current of hope to a town long accustomed to silence. In family homes scattered across Maryland and Pennsylvania, distant relatives of the Weathers lineage lived their lives unaware of the small, missing branch in their ancestry. Old photographs and dusty albums showed children at picnics, birthdays, and family reunions. In some pictures, an empty space lingered near the edge of the frame, as though the camera had unintentionally preserved the outline of someone absent. No one connected those gaps to the boy found at Frost Creek. Generations moved forward, without knowing the weight of what had been lost. On the 50th anniversary of the case, a local historian wrote a short article for the Ridgehaven newspaper. It was a gentle piece, reflecting on the mystery that had shadowed the town for half a century. He described the birch tree by the creek, now bent with age, and the way the winters still carried the same quiet heaviness. He ended the article with a simple line: "Some stories rest until someone chooses to wake them." The article circulated modestly, sparking small conversations in diners and barbershops, but no new information emerged. Then, nearly 2 decades later, the police department announced a full renovation of its basement archives. Boxes were pulled from shelves. Files were reorganized. Dust that had settled over half a century lifted into the air in small clouds. A young technician sorting through mislabeled containers found the old Ridgehaven file wedged behind a row of unrelated cases. The folder was worn, its edges frayed. Inside, the documents had yellowed, the photographs had softened, and the original slide boxes had cracked at their seams. The technician paused, studying the faded ink on the top page. Something about the case felt different from the others he had handled that day. It wasn't the age of the file or the volume of paperwork. It was the sense that the story had been waiting, patient and unresolved. He set the folder aside for review, unaware that this simple decision would ripple outward, reaching investigators who had grown up in an era where science could illuminate truths once buried by time. When Detective Lila Harrow eventually laid eyes on the file, decades of silence condensed into a single moment. She traced the lines of old notes, examined the artifacts, and wondered how so many pieces had slipped through so many hands. She saw potential where earlier investigators had found only dead ends. She saw a path forward shaped not by luck, but by the quiet resilience of memory. She didn't know yet what she might find. She only knew that the story wasn't finished. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The renovation of the Ridgehaven Police Archive began as a bureaucratic necessity, a simple modernization project aimed at replacing rusted shelves and outdated catalog systems. No one expected it to affect the town's oldest cold case. Yet one morning, as dust drifted in the beams of new overhead lights, a young technician named Daniel Carr pulled a box forward and noticed a slim folder wedged behind it, trapped against the concrete wall. He tugged it free and brushed the dust away. The label, faded and curling, carried a year he recognized only from local lore, 1958. Inside were brittle pages, softened photographs, and a series of evidence sleeves that had long since lost their rigidity. Most were empty or degraded. But near the bottom of the stack rested a cracked plastic slide container, labeled only with a nearly illegible scrawl. Carr opened it cautiously. A fragment, thin as a strand of hair, glinted from the corner of the slide. It looked almost crystalline under the bright LED lights. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt the urge to set the file aside, not for disposal, but for someone who might recognize its importance. When Detective Lila Harrow first examined the slide later that afternoon, she felt the faint tremor of possibility. The fragment was so small, it might have been dismissed by anyone else. But Harrow had spent years studying advanced forensic techniques. She knew what micro-extraction methods were capable of. She knew that modern laboratories could coax information from material once considered irretrievable. She slid the container into a protective case and drove it to the State Forensic Laboratory. The facility had high ceilings, polished floors, and a soft electronic hum. A senior geneticist, Dr. Annika Red, received the sample after Harrow explained its significance. Red examined the degraded slide through a magnifier, noting how the hair follicle had been preserved by chance, protected by the cold decades earlier and forgotten by archivists who likely assumed nothing remained of value. Red began the process by shaving an infinitesimal portion of the follicle root and isolating the nuclear remnants. The degradation was severe. The DNA strands had broken into countless fragments. But technology had evolved. Micromanipulators held the sample steady as a series of chemicals gently dissolved surrounding tissue. Fluorescence microscopes illuminated faint bands that pulsed with unexpected resilience. The sequencers hummed through the night, stitching together shards of code, aligning patterns that had not seen light since the mid-century. Harrow waited nearby, drinking stale coffee and watching the slow progress of the data as if guarding a fragile heartbeat. She didn't allow herself to hope too much. She had seen too many cases falter at the threshold of revelation. But when the genetic analyzer completed its run, the screen displayed a partial profile fragmented, but viable enough to submit to a genealogical database used for cold case identification. Red uploaded the profile, cross-referencing it through thousands of public and private records. Match points began appearing across a digital map, distant relatives, branching from counties in Maryland and Pennsylvania. The software ran simulations, building ancestral networks through census data, birth certificates, and archived marriage licenses. The branches grew clearer as names resolved themselves into families long settled in the region. At the center of one cluster, a particular lineage stood out, the Weathers family. Its branches diverged and twisted, marked by old guardianship filings and periods of separation. Harrow leaned closer as Red traced the line backward. A missing record emerged, a child whose birth was documented in 1953, but whose subsequent records vanished entirely. No school enrollment, no medical visits after his early years, no death certificate. A disappearing point on a family tree. The name surfaced with startling clarity: Eli Rowan Weathers. The Haven boy had never been anonymous to the world. He had simply been lost within the folds of a fractured family. The discovery did not immediately solve the case, but knowing his name shifted everything. It transformed the boy from an abstraction into a person with history, with relatives, with roots that stretched into present-day lives. Harrow felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest, a quiet, reverent heaviness. She reached out, lightly touching the top of the monitor as if acknowledging him. Over the next weeks, investigators contacted surviving members of the Weathers lineage. Some were shocked. Others were cautious, unsure how to reconcile the sudden emergence of a relative they had never known existed. A few shared stories of a branch of the family marked by hardship and secrecy. They recalled a relative, Marlon Vexler, who had once taken in children informally when households struggled. His name appeared in scattered social service notes from the 50s, though none mentioned Eli directly. Harrow and her team revisited properties connected to the Weathers line. One was the old house on Latchford Lane, the same place neighbors had reported unusual sounds decades earlier. The building had changed owners several times since the 50s, but the basement remained largely untouched. Behind the water heater, still faintly visible, were the remnants of small footprints disturbed long ago. The dust had settled differently across the concrete, leaving only a ghostly impression. Harrow crouched near the indentations. Even after all this time, the outline matched the size of a child around 5 or 6. The sight stirred something deep, a sense of standing at the very edge of his life. She imagined him standing quietly in that dim room, clutching his blanket, unsure what the next moment would bring. Returning to the archive, she examined old reports describing the cardboard box found near Frost Creek. One detail stood out to her: the diagonal scratches on the underside of the box. Earlier investigators had dismissed them, but Harrow noticed they matched a pattern seen in boxes stored in basements, where concrete had been poured unevenly, leaving ridges that scarred cardboard when dragged. She checked the cellar floor. There were ridges in the concrete, subtle, but aligned closely with the marks on the box. Piece by piece, the puzzle tightened. When they finally located Marlon Vexler, he was living in a care facility, frail and forgetful. At first, he denied ever caring for a child named Eli, but as Harrow spoke to him gently, mentioning the year, the relatives, the address, something flickered in his expression. He admitted there had been a boy once, quiet and thin. He claimed the child had been sickly, prone to wandering. He offered no explanation for why no one had seen the boy again. Detectives searched his last known property and uncovered a small recess behind a basement wall, as though someone had once carved out a hiding place. Inside were remnants of another time, a child's shoe, a broken wooden horse, an enamel bowl with faded paint. The wooden horse matched the description Mrs. Mallory had once given of the toy Eli loved but refused to take home. The connection sent a quiet shock through the investigative team. Tests on the shoe found microscopic traces of genetic material that aligned with the profile extracted earlier. The science was slow, methodical, but conclusive. Eli had been in that house. He had been hidden, perhaps confined, in that small dark space. And the cardboard box that carried him to Frost Creek had likely been stored in that same basement before being taken quietly through the yard, down the path, and into the woods. When the district attorney prepared charges against Vexler for crimes committed over 60 years earlier, the town reacted with a mix of relief and sorrow. Older residents who remembered the discovery at Frost Creek felt the past reopening, like a wound they had grown used to ignoring. Others, younger and unfamiliar with the full weight of the case, were moved by the idea that a nameless child had finally been given back his name. Harrow stood at the edge of Frost Creek on the night the news broke. Snow drifted across the clearing in soft spirals, echoing the morning the boy had first been found. She looked toward the birch tree, now bent with age, its bark scarred by decades of storms. For the first time, the place felt less like a grave and more like a chapter nearing its end. Eli Rowan Weathers had been lost to silence for a lifetime, but the silence had finally broken. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. When the investigators finally approached the care facility where Marlon Vexler lived, the winter afternoon light slanted through the windows with a muted gold that gave the moment an unearned softness. Harrow walked slowly down the hallway, past residents in wheelchairs, past orderlies adjusting blankets, past the quiet hum of a place where life moved at half speed. She carried with her the evidence file, though she already knew the pages inside were no longer just paperwork. They were the final bridge between the past and whatever fragile truth remained. Vexler sat near the window in a simple armchair, his hands resting on his knees. His hair had thinned to near transparency, and his eyes drifted unfocused toward the courtyard. When Harrow introduced herself, he looked up with a kind of slow, confused recognition, as though her presence stirred something he had tried to bury for a lifetime. She placed the photograph of the wooden horse on the table between them. His gaze flickered, dipped, and then returned to the window. She told him the name Eli Rowan Weathers and watched a long stillness settle over him. He attempted a denial, but the words lacked conviction. A tremor ran through his hands. He spoke haltingly about a child who wouldn't listen and a sickly boy who cried too often, fragments of excuses shaped by decades of self-protection. Harrow didn't interrupt. She let the silence press gently against him until his voice cracked beneath its weight. He never offered a full confession. Not in the way stories sometimes imagine. But what he did say, and what he avoided saying, formed an unbroken chain. Enough for charges, enough for a trial, enough for the truth to step out from the long shadow where it had been waiting. The day he was arrested, snow drifted across Ridgehaven again, echoing the winter the boy had been found. Officers escorted Vexler from the facility quietly. Residents watched with a mix of curiosity and confusion. A few recognized the surname, whispering among themselves about rumors from decades past. As he was placed into the transport car, Vexler looked not at the officers, but at the sky. Harrow wondered if he saw the same cold brightness that had once hung over Frost Creek. The courtroom was a small chamber, paneled in dark wood, polished by decades of hands. On the morning of the arraignment, people gathered long before the doors opened. Some were relatives of the Weathers lineage, distant branches who had never known Eli existed. Others were older residents who remembered the news from 1958, the shock that had moved through Ridgehaven like a sudden storm. They carried with them a quiet need not for spectacle, but for acknowledgement. Vexler arrived in a wheelchair, pushed forward by an attendant. His shoulders hunched, his breathing shallow. The weight of age formed its own kind of shield, but not one thick enough to obscure what the evidence made clear. When he looked around the room, his eyes paused briefly on the reconstructed image of the child projected onto a small screen. He flinched, almost imperceptibly. The prosecution presented the facts with measured clarity. They spoke of the DNA extracted from the preserved follicle, of the genealogical mapping that led to the Weathers family, of the concrete ridges that matched the scratches beneath the box. They described the hidden recess in the basement wall, the child's shoe, the wooden horse, the enamel bowl, all pieces that formed the outline of a life lived in secrecy and fear. They didn't dramatize. They didn't raise their voices. They allowed the truth to carry its own weight. The defense argued failing memory, argued the passage of time, argued that no one could know exactly what had happened. But each argument dissolved under the steady accumulation of evidence. The shoe held traces of Eli's DNA. The wooden horse connected him to the Mallory's memories. The genealogical tree placed him firmly within the Weathers lineage. The basement ridges matched the markings on the box. The combination left little room for doubt. When the judge reviewed the case, the courtroom settled into a profound stillness, a kind of collective inhalation. The verdict came in a voice neither triumphant nor cruel, simply firm, acknowledging the weight of 60 years, guilty of manslaughter under the statutes of the time. The punishment was symbolic more than practical. Wexler was elderly and frail, yet the conviction mattered. It named the wrongdoing. It recognized the life that had been taken. In the quiet moments after the verdict, Harrow watched members of the Weathers family react in different ways. A middle-aged woman wiped tears from her cheeks, though she had only learned Eli's name months earlier. A man in his 50s whispered, "We should have known." Another stared straight ahead, jaw tight, carrying a sorrow he had no words for. Family trees do not forget their missing branches, even when no one speaks of them. Later, outside the courthouse, a small group gathered beneath a gray sky that promised snow. Reporters spoke softly into microphones. Town residents hugged each other, unsure whether to feel relieved or heartbroken. A woman placed a small blue ribbon on the railing, its color echoing the blanket that had once shielded the boy from the cold. A gust of wind lifted the ribbon slightly, making it flutter as though waving for someone too far away to see. Harrow stood apart from the crowd, holding the reconstructed photograph. She traced the curve of the child's cheek with her thumb, imagining the life he might have lived. She wondered if he would have grown into someone who loved music, or someone who collected smooth stones from the creek, or someone who simply wanted a quiet place to belong. In stories like his, closure never meant the absence of pain. It meant carrying the truth forward with tenderness. That evening, she drove to Frost Creek alone. The snow had begun again, falling in soft spirals around the birch tree that leaned toward the water. She walked to the edge of the clearing, listening to the muted trickle beneath the ice. She felt the presence of everything that had happened there. Fear, abandonment, discovery, grief, but layered now with something new. Not peace exactly, but recognition. The land no longer felt like a silent witness. It felt like a place where a voice had finally been heard. She whispered the boy's name into the cold air, letting it drift across the creek. The sound was soft, but it felt full, anchored. As she turned to leave, she imagined that for the first time in decades, the story was no longer suspended in winter. It had taken shape. It had been spoken. It had found its way into the world that once forgot it. Justice, late but certain, had closed the circle. In the weeks after the verdict, Ridgehaven moved through its routines with a gentler quiet than before. The town had lived with the weight of an unnamed child for so long that finally, knowing his place in the world, created a stillness that felt different from the old silence. Stores opened with their usual rhythm. Children walked home from school beneath winter skies, and the creek ran a little clearer as early thaw seeped through the hills. For the Weathers family, the news settled unevenly. Some felt relief in finally acknowledging a lost branch of their lineage. Others struggled with guilt for stories left untold or questions never asked. Yet as they gathered in living rooms and community halls, they found themselves speaking Eli's name with a kind of hesitant reverence, as though afraid to disturb a memory too delicate to touch. Over time, the name grew steadier, easier, shaped by a quiet gratitude that the child they never knew had been given back to them. A new tradition emerged among the older residents who remembered the early years. On cold mornings, a few walked down to Frost Creek carrying small tokens: a blue ribbon, a folded note, a single white flower. They placed them near the birch tree where the box had once rested. None stayed long, but each pause became a gesture of recognition, a way of telling the past that it had been seen and understood. Detective Harrow carried the case with her in a different way. After the trial, she returned often to the archive room where she first held the fragile slide that changed everything. She would stand quietly among the shelves, remembering how easily the evidence could have been discarded, how many moments of chance had guided the path toward justice. The room no longer felt like a graveyard of forgotten stories. It felt like a reminder that even the smallest trace can hold the weight of a life. As winter deepened, the photograph of Eli's reconstructed face found its way into a small memorial frame displayed at the police department. Officers passing through would pause briefly, not out of morbid fascination, but out of respect. The image served as a quiet promise that they would not forget him again, or the lessons his case carried, that stories grow louder when given time, that truth often lives in patience, and that some kinds of justice arrive not as triumphs but as soft, steady acknowledgments. The creek changed with the season. Ice formed along its edges in delicate, feathered patterns. Snow settled around the old birch tree, softening its rough bark. On certain evenings, when the sky glowed pale pink in the last light of day, the place felt almost warm, as if the earth itself carried a memory it no longer guarded with sorrow. The cold no longer seemed harsh. It seemed reflective, carrying echoes of footsteps, voices, and the small life that had once passed through this space. Eli's legacy did not reshape the world, but it reshaped Ridgehaven in quiet, meaningful ways. Families checked on one another more often. Neighbors offered help without needing to be asked. Children grew up hearing not the frightening version of the old story, but the hopeful one, that even forgotten names can one day be remembered, and even the smallest life deserves a place in the world's memory. In the end, the story did not belong to tragedy alone. It belonged to the people who carried it forward, the couple who cared for him, the investigators who refused to let the file fade, the scientists who pieced fragments into identity, the family who reclaimed him, and the community that learned to speak his name with love instead of fear. And on the quietest days, when the wind moved gently through the birch branches, it felt as if something had been set right. Not perfectly, not fully, but enough for the story to rest. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.